Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski on Sheikh Chesed, New York City, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School in Long Island. It's great to see you guys. I want to say we have the most amazing Parsha this week, Parshat Metzora. If you want to introduce someone to Judaism, start with start with Parshat Metzora, because
if they like it, you know you got them.
if they like it. But my proposition, I think, is that there's some very deep ideas here.
Well, it's only skin deep.
Concerning individuals who have skin ailments, house ailments, and other kinds of discharges, which we may not get into.
Right. If you get to chapter 15, though, it overflows with stuff.
Thank you, Barry Chesler. Well, here's how the Parsha starts. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, Zot tieh Tzara'at ha-Metzora. This is the law or the ritual of the Metzora, which is translated usually as the leper, but it probably means someone who's afflicted with this skin ailment. Probably a skin ailment that's not like psoriasis or eczema or something. In the research that I've read on this, they don't identify a modern skin ailment with of Tzara'at. It was probably a scale disease. It had some kind of phenomenology, or that you looked white with it. And here's where it's going, which is you look like a dead person when you have this disease. Your skin turns white, and you lose all the color. And my sense is that part of what's going on in all of the purity rules is you're coming close to death, and that is reflected on your skin. So you're reacting.
So a couple of observations. I find the terminology curious, Metzora as opposed to an ish with Tzara'at. That the fact that they express it verbally suggests that it's some kind of active disease that is perhaps changing in some way, certainly changing the person who's afflicted more than we might think if we just use a noun to describe the disease as the person has. But, it's striking. There are two cases of Tzara'at-like things in the Torah. One, of course, is the famous story of Miriam, when she becomes white as snow after the words about Moses' wife. But the other person, this was one of the signs that God gave to Moshe at the burning bush. Only
Right.
There was just his hand that was afflicted. So it's interesting, Elliot, because we think of it in terms of death, the living dead, if your whole body or most of your body is afflicted, but the very first time it's just a sign of God's presence.
Well, isn't it interesting? Back to Miriam, she spoke about Ha'isha HaKushit, that she was black, and her punishment is that she turns completely white. And I think Richard Friedman in his commentary makes this kind of quip. It's the irony of the punishment that is the reverse of what she spoke about. But Jeremy, in Tanakh, there are some references to Tzara'at, and the Haftarah that is normally chanted on this Shabbat includes a story of four of these guys.
It does indeed. I think it's 2 Kings chapter 7, if I am not mistaken. Is that correct? There were 4 men lepers outside the gate. This is the terrible Aramean siege of Shomron, and Shomron's in a terrible famine, and people are, they're just buying a tiny amount of food for a ridiculous amount of money, and they're all starving to death. And Elisha tells them, this is turning around, and you're going to get cheap food. So there are 4 men lepers outside the gate, and they say to each other, they're lepers. They're outside the gate because they are lepers. At whatever level, it's clear to us that there's a kind of primitive, epidemiology. For the past 2 years, all of us throughout the world, certainly all of us in America, we've been worried about disease and contagion and how do we control. So these folks are outside the city, some sort of contagion, whatever it is that they intuit. And the people say, well, we're just going to starve to death here. We're going to just, if we throw ourselves on the mercy of the Aramean camp, maybe they'll take care of us. When they get to the camp, God has done a miracle. He's driven the soldiers away, and they have all the riches of the camp, and they are very civic. Even though they've been Metzoraim, even though they've been exiled from the community, they're worried about the rest of the city in Shomron. Vayomru, Isharehu lochen anachnu osim hayom hazeh, lochen anachnu osim, we're not doing well. Hayom hazeh yom besorahu, this is a day of good news. And we are not sharing the good news with our fellows. So they go and they tell the people, and they come and they have the food, and the siege is lifted and the famine ends, and everybody's doing wonderfully. It's an image that salvation sometimes comes through, so to speak, les miserables, right? The most wretched of society, the loneliest, saddest, most battered people actually, in a case like this, turn out to be the instruments of salvation. Now, the wonderful, 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 she died before the state, so you can't really call her an Israeli poet, but she's a modern Hebrew poet.
A Palestinian poet.
She's the Palestinian poet, and I don't mean Mahmoud Darwish, I mean Rachel. She's like, I think of her as the Hebrew Emily Dickinson, just beautiful, beautiful small lyrics. And she has a poem about this, and it's very strange. It's a little hard to know exactly what to make of this poem. She says, I do not want salvation from the mouth of the leper. Ach ani lo ova besorat geula imipi Metzora hitavo. I accept no promise of salvation if it comes from the mouth of the leper. Hatahor yivaser v'ga'al hatahor. Let the pure promise, let the pure announce and redeem the pure. V'im yadolo timtza ligol, and if he's too poor to redeem, as nivchar li limpol b'mitzukat hamatzor, or layom Shabbat Hagadol. I would rather fall in the crisis of the siege on the eve before the great promise gleams. She seems to be saying something like, we here in this early state, we kibbutznikim, we have to use good methods to get to the redeemed world, not bad methods. As a matter of fact, this poem that I just read a piece of was printed on the front page of Haaretz the day after the Irgun blew up the King David Hotel, and the meaning of which was what I just said. Like, we're fighting for a new future, but we cannot use the methods of the quote unquote Metzora, the ugly or stricken methods. We have to use only the pure methods. But I also think it's like a bizarre and perverse misunderstanding of this great story, which is that the people who you think are kind of like the losers, so to speak, or the wretched, actually they have the message of Shabbat Hagadol. They have the message of a possible redemption. So I think that's, for me, that story is usually in the Haftarah is really quite moving.
It's fascinating, but and not only that, but it seems that the gist of the Parsha here of Metzora is to be compassionate to the person who is afflicted. After all, the Kohen diagnoses this person, the Kohen has to do the purification rituals on this person, and all of these rituals are in effect a way of bringing people back into the community. I used this last year, to talk about the idea that, here we are, so many of us have been in isolation, and the whole psychological dislocation that we experience by being isolated from everybody, by being indoor, by not, wanting to spread or endanger ourselves by coming into contact with the disease, the raging disease outside, and then to be affirmed, and we never really had a ceremony of coming back into the synagogue because it was staggered over the course of many weeks, and to a certain extent it's still staggered. A lot of people are still very apprehensive about resuming the a regular routine life of communal worship. It's a very, very strange time still. And so you need a way of marking that transition. And I think what is going on in the Parsha is the Kohanim are ordaining a ritual of transition, of taking the individual who has experienced this, and through blood and all sorts of sprinklings and all sorts of different kinds of things, they're taking this individual and bringing them back into society.
One of the pieces of evidence for what you just said about the sort of fundamental compassion about this, and of course it is possible to read this as stigmatizing illness and quote unquote ableism or whatever it is that we would say, but the sacrifice for the Metzora is one of there's not a huge number of these, but there's a handful of what's called Korban Olevi Yored, a sacrifice of variable amounts. Rich people should offer a bull or a ram, or
it's a sliding scale.
Sliding scales, and poorer people can offer birds, but the poorest of the poor, the poorest people, they can just offer a little bit of flour.
A little flour, that's right.
And so it's a way of saying, in the Korban Olevi Yored, we have, as communal imperative, we have to find a way to bring everyone back in. And listen, if you can afford it, you should give a good sacrifice, but it doesn't matter. Whatever you can afford, that's going to be a good sacrifice.
Make a donation.
I think to add to what you say is that if we think of the disease as somehow symbolic of death while still alive, a living death, as it were,
yes,
that what the ritual comes to teach us is that the disease itself is not the end, that there is an aftermath, there is a kind of resolution, and that you can wait it out.
Yeah.
And we all know of people for whom that was not the case. Not all diseases are susceptible to that, but it's especially important for a disease where it's described as being so disfiguring that there is some measure of hope, that we understand that there is a future.
Let's take a moment to talk about the disease that could come to your household. So we're going to fast forward to verse 33 of chapter 14. When you come into the land of Canaan, asher ani noten lachem, that I am giving you, la'achuzah, as an inheritance, v'natati neged Tzara'at beveit eretz achuzatchem, and I will give you a plague on your house,
How fortunate!
And it's interesting, and I mentioned this before we started recording, that the rabbis pick up on this, and they say, the expression kitavo has a kind of heraldic quality to it. It's like, oh, this is really exciting, because we have a passage in Deuteronomy where it says kitavo la'aretz. I mean, it's a big passage. Most of it is quoted at the Haggadah for the Seder, the pilgrim ritual of the first fruits, where it's very exciting. And here it's like kitavo la'aretz, and you're going to have a plague on your house. You're going to have fungus in your house, or molds, or all sorts of stuff. And the rabbis, create a beautiful midrash saying that the people were very excited to occupy homes of the Canaanites, because the Canaanites had, secreted some of their wealth in the walls. They hid their jewelry, they hid their gold and silver in the walls, so that none of the conquering Israelites would be able to possess them. But the Israelites who conquered these homes were very, very excited to tear them down when they got fungus. It's a kind of backhanded way of saying, of talking about this plague as not as a misfortune, but as something that is positive, and seeing unfortunate reality through rose-colored glasses. But I'm fascinated by it. And Jeremy, maybe you want to talk about this for a second, because having just completed this book on mycology, the study of fungi, I think the more that I look at it, fungi, is it fungi or fungi? In Italian, it would be fungi, right?
If you're reading a linguini alla fungi,
yes, right. So it's a fascinating world, the world of fungi.
I just read this book called The Entangled Life by the writer with a spectacular name, Merlin Sheldrake. He's he teaches at Cambridge or something like that. He used to teach at Hogwarts, but then he moved over to Cambridge. But it is a crazy and fascinating book. The guy is a mycologist, a fungus specialist, and all kinds of crazy things that I knew nothing about the role of fungus, in biology. The fungi grow in these massive connected underground, incredibly thin, but incredibly wide sheets called mycelium.
Yes.
And so when a mushroom pops up, it is a flower of a vast mycelium covering the earth many times around. He writes about all kinds of things, including truffles as delicacies and psychedelic properties of mushrooms, but also incredibly about the way that funguses have the capacity to break down all kinds of organic and even inorganic material. So they have a role perhaps to play in environmental crises, but they also are just indispensable. And I knew nothing of this in getting nutrients from the soil into trees. And when they join up with algae, forming lichens, breaking down minerals. And the guy said the amazing line: the minerals in your body, when you have an iron or you have calcium or something like that, the minerals, they are probably rocks that lichens, that is to say algae plus fungi, have broken down, put into the soil, and then it's come up into your plant.
Isn't that amazing? So yeah, we can't live without fungi. They're necessary for breaking down. Of course, unfortunately sometimes you do get athlete's foot, and some people do get fungal infections are horrible. I mean, they're people, they can be very dangerous. However, this is a fungal infection in your home, and many people have experienced that, especially in Highland Park, New Jersey, because a lot of people have their basements flooded when there are heavy rains, and when you have damp, dark environments, that's where you're going to get the fungus among us, and you need to call your mold busters to come in and get them. But in the Torah, the experience of fungus in your home, so it's interesting because we in the adjacent cultures, they would attribute this to all sorts of kinds of misfortune and punishment and spirits and whatever. But the Torah is remarkably void of all of these supernatural things. There's no supernatural causation. It's not a punishment. It's not because of demons. It's because sometimes mold happens. Sometimes you get a moldy home, and if it's really bad, it's really bad. I mean, there are people that have such sensitivity to molds that they really can't live in their homes. They have to move. If some kind of, I knew someone who had this. And it's not an environmental, but the mold throws off all sorts. The spores are all very toxic, and you can be very sensitive and develop all sorts of diseases from that. I don't think that was the issue back then. It's just annoying. It's a terrible thing.
Well, the way you present it, Elliot, is that it's something natural.
Yeah.
But that impulse to supernaturalize it carries itself through the rabbinic period, because Tzara'at, which we talked about earlier, the rabbis identify with Lashon Hara.
But what do they identify for the home?
Well, there's a curious sugya in Sanhedrin where the Ben Sorer Umoreh, the stubborn and rebellious son, and the Beta Menugah, the house that's been afflicted by this plague, and the third thing, of course, escapes me at the moment.
Well, first of all, Job is in there too.
About things that where there's a big debate among the rabbis, where one says this never happened, and another guy says I was there. I was on the grave of the
rebellious child.
The rebellious child. Oh, it's Zeir Nidachat. It's a city that devoted itself to idol worship. Or I saw the remains of the ruin of the city of that devoted itself to
Idolatrous city.
slavery. And I saw the remains of this house that was plagued. And you get this curious thing in the Talmud where you get opinions that cannot stand side by side in human discourse. It cannot be that one person says, I was there, and the other person says, this could never have happened, because those people have nothing to say to each other.
Interesting.
And yet the Talmud puts them side by side, or one, I mean, visually we have to see one on top of the other, I guess. But it's a curious way of looking at the world that the Talmud preserves, because the Talmud, in a sense, thrives on paradox, which we, especially as rational Westerners, I think spend a good deal of our intellectual lives trying to resolve rather than embracing.
Actually, when you say that, Barry, it makes me think about what we consider to be, decisive evidence. Like if I had a theory, let's just say I had a theory that I'll make up, something that's in our culture, but like it's not true. There was no near-death experiences, and you don't see the light, and it's lack of oxygen to the brain, or whatever. This is just it's a brain phenomenon that can be explained in purely physical ways that needs no other explanation. And somebody else says, I actually had that experience.
Yeah.
And how would we put those two things together? We might say, well, I'm not going to deny your personal interpretation of your own experience, but I don't really think you're correct about what happened. And the other guy says, well, you and your theories can go stick it in your ear. I know what I saw. So maybe something like that. I mean,
well, we abide that with religion, because I think that if we take our own religion seriously, we have to admit in some way that other religions cannot be true the way they represent themselves. And so I think that when we're honest, we could say that Christianity and Islam, to use the two Western examples, are great, meaningful religions, but we can't accept their storyline.
we can't accept that. We can't accept that Muhammad was the final prophet.
Right. Or that Jesus was resurrected on the third day. Maybe the fourth day we would
the fourth
grant.
day is fine, no, but not the third day.
All right.
So,
speaking of, go ahead. Just make it.
But that we can make some sense of, right?
Okay.
We live here in America. We live amongst people who profess the three great monotheistic religions, and on good days for each of us as individuals and as a society, we live in peace. But there's a limit to what we can say to them, right? We can respect people and we could share what we believe, but at some point we have to each go our separate way.
I actually don't. I'm actually not with you exactly in the same thing, because I think that once we get into the realms of these things, most of our religious truths are, I would say, poetic and non-literal, such that, I mean, if you want to insist, no, Muhammad had the final revelation that exists in humanity, and that's just a physical fact, then I say, okay, we can't be compatible. But I think that we can have cultural traditions that we treat as poetry.
Absolutely. But did Muhammad rise up to heaven on a horse from the Temple Mount? I don't think so.
It was a little bit to the west of the Temple Mount.
Well, okay. So go ahead.
I just said, Masesha Haya, I used to work with a woman who said once that she and her family practiced astral projection, out-of-body experiences. Now, it's hard to keep a straight face when someone says that, but I managed. But at some point, there's nothing that we can say to each other. I don't think that's possible. And she's telling me this was something that happened to her and her family. And, she was a great person. That wasn't the point. But at some point, the conversation cannot advance. And we have to say that, this is your truth and this is my truth.
Okay, so Elliot, if I can just say one thing about the non-supernatural. I do think that clearly the story of Miriam in Bamidbar means that maybe not every instance of Tzara'at is a punishment, but her instance of Tzara'at is a punishment.
That's
okay?
skin. I'm talking about houses. House.
I think this still goes to our passage here in Vayikra 14 and 15.
Yeah.
Which is not interested. Is interested in dealing with this practically,
Yeah.
Maybe there is a metaphysical, cast to the story because the ritual is a little bit, it's high ritual. It involves birds flying away to the countryside and whatever. Maybe there's a little metaphysical stuff between the lines there, but I just want to concur with you that the fact of Miriam's story does not mean that everybody in this story is presumed to be punished.
Indeed.
This story just is a society dealing with a problem and says we got to figure out a way
Right,
to
this is a solution.
put people
right,
back
so-
into the community and the houses safe again.
Let's just segue right now to this Shabbat is it's a really big Shabbos, Shabbat Hagadol. Shabbat Hagadol, the great Shabbat, known because A, it is the Shabbat before Pesach, and B, because of the Haftarah. And on the theme of reconciliation, and here, this is what piqued my interest in what you said, Barry, because you have the possibility of irreconcilable narratives in different religious narratives. They're not reconcilable. But what Malachi he's the final, it's the final prophecy of the books of prophecy, about 500 BCE, of the returning exiles, and the last two sentences are part of the Haftarah of the last, in this three verses. Zichru Torat Moshe Avdi, remember the Torah of Moses, my servant, Asher tziviti oto b'chorev, that I commanded him in Horev, Al kol Yisrael chukim u'mishpatim, the laws, the statutes. Hine anochi sholeach lachem et Eliah hanavi. Behold, I am sending to you Elijah the prophet. Okay, Difne bo yom Adonai, before the coming of the great, of God, Hagadol Havanora, the great day in which the Lord will arrive. Veshiv levavot, and here's the reconciliation. Veshiv levavot al banim, he shall reconcile the hearts of fathers with sons, v'lev banim al avotam, and the hearts of sons with their fathers. Penavovi kete et haaretz cherem, lest I come and destroy the land and make it desolate. And what is so fascinating there is that the final word of prophecy is exactly what you've been saying, which is reconciliation. Here it's a very specific kind of reconciliation of parents and children, fathers and sons, quite literally, but certainly figuratively, all parents and all children, with the understanding that a tremendous chasm can arise between these generations. I think it's probably among the most painful experiences that a parent can have or a child can have, the sense of estrangement from a parent, abuse, or any other kind of just horrible circumstances that push people apart, parents from children and children from parents. It's probably the saddest thing that any of us encounter, certainly as rabbis and just in human experience. And here Elijah's saying, that's the reconciliation is going to come. That's the harbinger of redemption. And I don't know how you react. I mean, redemption is, of course, the theme of Pesach. And what is he doing? What is Malachi doing here? How is he reframing the whole understanding with the personality of Elijah? And maybe we need to drink a lot of wine here to really ponder this. But in the 30 seconds that we have left, give me some of your best thoughts on reconciliation and redemption, Barry.
On one hand, I think it's presented as a miracle if it requires prophetic intervention to bring about. On the other hand, if it doesn't happen, the world will be destroyed, and we're actually commanded, as it were, to wait it out. So I think it actually gives a great message of hope that we're not going to solve all of the world's problems, all of our own problems in this world, but we can, with good intention, puzzle things through.
What about therapy?
Well, therapy could be part of it. But in other words, I think sometimes we want everything to happen. Like you were talking earlier about the purist.
Yeah.
And when you had mentioned earlier when we were talking before about the King David Hotel, and the purity of people's opinions, related with the poem of Rachel, we can't always have purity in our life, and we have to allow for the impure. I think that's part of the message of the Torah reading, that the impure is part of our life, but it's not the end of our life.
In other words,
And
the chaos
and
and the messiness of life is going to intrude on
right,
all of
and
the
when we think of the Haggadah, the great image of the Haggadah is of reconciled parents and children, because the Seder itself is supposed to be a dialogue between the parent and the child, and one that is of respect and teaching. And that's what carries the tradition forward.
as opposed to master and disciple, which is the rabbinic culture. The rabbis create, the model that we interact with our masters. Also, that's hovering in the Seder as well.
Indeed.
But I don't know, Jeremy, you have
First I just want to observe that that Malachi being the final prophetic writer, the fact that he already has this view that Eliyahu Navi is going to be the harbinger of a new world, that tells you how old that little trope, that religious trope is. Incredibly old. But I'm now not really speaking about the meaning of the deep question that you asked, just an observation textually, which is that Elijah, in the stories about him, in this second half of the book of First Kings and then the very beginning of the book of Second Kings, he is like a lone wolf. He does have a disciple, Elisha ben Shaphat, but he's a loner, and he zings around and he shows up and then he disappears again, and he's not portrayed to have a family. In fact, when he goes to Chorev, he sort of replicates Moses' journey. He goes back to Mount Sinai. God speaks to him out there, and God's not in the wind, not in the earthquake, and not in the fire, but there's still small voice. And at one point, or actually 2 points, twice God says to him, "What the hell are you doing here?" And he says, the people have all abandoned the covenant, va'ani va'ivater ani levadi, and I am left all alone. And Elijah comes to every bris, and one of the things that we sort of tell about that story is he comes to every bris because he said falsely, the Jewish people have abandoned the covenant. Nuh-uh, we have not abandoned the covenant, and you have to come and look at it. Yeah. And I think maybe there's something like that going on here, which is to say, v'ivater ani levadi, I'm all alone. Maybe we need to counteract that a little bit and connect people and not be so all alone. Human connection, familial connection, and
it's a perfect opening to the Seder, because the Seder is really, in its excellence, it's a moment of coming together. And Elijah is also present at the Seder. I mean, you're never alone at the Seder. I guess, certainly many people have been over the last 2 years, but ideally, the ideal Seder is to be together with people. And so Elijah is present with people in the covenantal way that we are forming covenants, around our tables or at a Brit Milah, but certainly with Pesach coming out, and we all have our Kos Eliyahu filling it up so that he'll have a drink and enjoy. And that's part of the Simcha that's coming on the great day that Malachi is speaking of, which ends our time together. We have come to another conclusion of Parsha Talk, and we want to thank everybody for joining us, either watching or listening. Thank you for your comments. There's a t-shirt that's available. You can get the link from Barry's Facebook page. And we look forward. We're going to be with you next week, even though Rabbi Kalmanovsky is flying off to Israel soon enough. But we're going to get a Parsha Talk in before Pesach, so that you'll all have some extra things to talk about at your Seders. In the meantime, we want to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbat, a Shabbat Hagadol, a great and beautiful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Bye-bye.